How could a simple act of kindness, a few dollars given each morning, save me from disaster? The night a homeless woman warned me not to go home, I listened. The next day, I watched my apartment burn on the morning news, and that was only the beginning of my revenge against those who tried to erase me. My name is Calvin Mercer, and at 42, I've learned that being the last honest man on a street full of sharks makes you their favorite target. Every morning at 7:15 sharp, I descended the narrow staircase from my second-floor apartment to the bustling pedestrian street below. The building that housed my family home had been transformed over the past decade into a commercial gold mine. 8 different food establishments occupied every square foot of the ground floor, from artisanal pizza joints to trendy bubble tea shops. Mine was the only residential unit left in the entire block. The morning routine never varied. I'd step onto Meridian Street, where the aroma of fresh coffee mixed with the exhaust from delivery trucks, and walk exactly 30 feet to where Eleanor Price sat on her folded cardboard, back against the brick wall of Morrison's Deli. Eleanor was somewhere in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the street's daily theater. Her clothes were worn but clean, and she possessed a dignity that the bustling crowd of business owners and customers seemed determined to ignore. "Morning, Eleanor," I'd say, slipping a $5 bill into her weathered hands. "Morning, Calvin. You take care of yourself today," she'd reply, her voice carrying a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold efficiency of the commercial district around us. This particular Tuesday started like any other, but the undercurrent of tension that had been building for months felt especially thick. As I handed Eleanor her money, I noticed Victor Russo watching us from the entrance of his flagship restaurant, Russo's Italian Kitchen. Victor was 46, built like a man who'd traded his construction boots for expensive suits, but kept the aggressive posture. His restaurant occupied the prime corner spot of our building, and he'd made no secret of his ambitions to expand. "You're too generous for your own good," Eleanor murmured, her fingers closing around the bill. "Some folks around here don't appreciate generosity. They see it as weakness." I glanced toward Victor, who was now deep in conversation with his wife Janine. She was 39, polished in that particular way that screamed expensive salon visits and designer clothes bought with other people's money. Janine managed the day-to-day operations of the restaurant while Victor handled what he called business development, which mostly involved pressuring me to sell my apartment. After my brief exchange with Eleanor, I continued to my usual morning destination, Brewster's Coffee House, located on the ground floor of my own building. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had to pay for coffee in a shop that operated directly beneath my bedroom. Toby Brewster, the 30-something owner, had always been cordial enough, but lately his smiles felt forced. As I waited in line, I couldn't help but overhear the conversation at the corner table where several business owners held their informal morning meeting. "I'm telling you, it's ridiculous," said Francine Delacroix, who ran the French pastry shop 2 doors down. One guy holding up progress for the entire block. "It's selfish." "More than selfish," Victor's voice cut through the ambient noise. "It's stupid. The offer we made last month was generous to a fault. Most people would jump at that kind of money." Janine's laugh was sharp and calculated. "Maybe he's waiting for an even better offer. Some people get greedy when they think they have leverage." "What leverage?" Victor scoffed. "He's one man in a building full of businesses. He's already outnumbered." I kept my expression neutral as I ordered my usual black coffee, but my jaw clenched involuntarily. These people discussed my life and my home as if I were a piece of furniture they needed to rearrange. The apartment upstairs wasn't just property to me. It was where my parents had brought me as a child, where my father taught me to fix leaky faucets and understand the value of things that couldn't be bought or sold. It was where my mother cooked Sunday dinners until she moved to Arizona because of her arthritis, and where I'd promised my father, near the end of his life, that I would keep the family legacy intact. But explaining sentiment to people like Victor Russo was like explaining color to someone who'd been blind since birth. As I turned to leave with my coffee, Victor intercepted me near the door. Up close, his cologne was overpowering, and his smile had all the warmth of a loan shark's handshake. "Calvin, perfect timing. I was just thinking about you." "I'm sure you were," I replied evenly. "Listen, I know we've had this conversation before, but I wanted to make sure you understood the scope of what we're offering." Victor pulled out his phone and showed me a number that made my coffee taste bitter. "That's the new figure. Cash deal, close in 30 days. You could buy a house in the suburbs, maybe get a nice yard, some peace and quiet." "I have peace and quiet." Victor's smile faltered slightly. "Do you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're living above a construction zone. All these businesses expanding, renovating, updating their equipment. Must be noisy up there." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. I'd noticed the increase in renovation noise lately. power tools running at odd hours, delivery trucks arriving before dawn, construction that seemed to serve no visible purpose other than disruption. "I'm fine," I said simply. "Of course you are. But think about the future, Calvin. This street is changing, evolving. You don't want to be the guy who gets left behind." Before I could respond, Janine appeared at Victor's elbow, her smile as artificial as her highlighted hair. "Calvin, sweetie, you look tired. This whole situation must be so stressful for you." Her voice dripped with fake concern. "You know, we're not just business owners here. We're a community, a family, and families take care of each other." "Families don't usually try to buy each other out," I observed. Janine's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Well, sometimes family members have to make tough decisions for the good of everyone involved." I finished my coffee and headed for the door, but Victor's voice followed me. "Think about it, Calvin. Really think about it. Because opportunities like this don't last forever." The rest of the day passed in a haze of routine. My job as a systems analyst for a mid-sized engineering firm provided steady income and the kind of logical problem-solving that kept my mind sharp. But when I returned home that evening, I found an envelope that had been slipped under my door. The message inside was typed on plain white paper. "Sell now or regret it." No signature, no return address, just a threat dressed up as advice. I stood in my living room, looking out the window at the street below where Eleanor was packing up her few belongings for the night. The businesses were closing, their neon signs flickering off one by one, and I could see Victor and Janine through the window of their restaurant, heads bent over what looked like architectural plans. As I watched, Janine glanced up and noticed me in my window. She said something to Victor, who looked up as well. Even from this distance, I could see Victor's smile, predatory and confident, like a man who'd already won a game I didn't know I was playing. I pulled the curtains closed and tried to convince myself that this was just business, just the normal friction that came with urban development. But as I settled into bed, Eleanor's words echoed in my mind. "Some folks around here don't appreciate generosity. They see it as weakness." The question that kept me awake wasn't whether Victor and Janine saw my refusal to sell as weakness. It was what they were willing to do about it. The threatening note wasn't the beginning. It was just the first time someone had been bold enough to put their intentions in writing. Over the next few days, as I reflected on the escalating pressure, I realized that what I'd initially dismissed as coincidence had actually been a carefully orchestrated campaign of intimidation. It started 3 years ago, not long after my father's funeral. I'd inherited the apartment free and clear, along with his stubborn streak and his belief that some things were worth more than their market value. The building had already been converted to mixed use, with commercial spaces on the ground floor and my apartment as the sole residential holdout. Initially, the business owners had been respectful, even friendly. Toby from the coffee shop had brought me a sympathy card and a free bag of beans. Francine from the pastry shop had offered to cater the small memorial service. But respect turned to curiosity when the first developer approached me 6 months later. Harrison Properties offered me twice what the apartment was worth on paper, assuming I'd jump at the chance for easy money. When I politely declined, explaining that the place had sentimental value, they seemed genuinely surprised, but accepted my decision gracefully. The second offer came from Meridian Development Group 8 months after that. This time, the number was even higher, and the approach was more aggressive. Their representative, a sharp-dressed woman named Patricia Vance, spent 20 minutes explaining how my apartment was an inefficient use of prime commercial real estate, and how I could maximize my investment potential by selling. "Mr. Mercer," she'd said, sitting in my living room and eyeing my father's old furniture with barely concealed disdain. "Sentiment is a luxury that most people can't afford. You're sitting on a gold mine." "I'm sitting in my home," I'd replied. Patricia's smile had been patronizing. "Of course, but homes can be replaced. Opportunities like this cannot." I'd declined that offer too, and Patricia had left with a business card and a warning disguised as advice. "The market won't wait forever, Mr. Mercer. Property values in transitioning neighborhoods can be volatile." The third offer came from Victor Russo himself, about 18 months ago. By then, he'd already established his restaurant as the anchor tenant of the building, and his ambitions were expanding. Victor didn't just want to buy my apartment, he wanted to convert it into private dining rooms for high-end events, complete with a rooftop terrace that would require significant structural modifications. "This isn't just about money, Calvin," Victor had said during our first formal meeting, held in his restaurant after hours. The dining room was dimly lit, and Victor's associates, including his lawyer, Darren Yu, sat around the table like a corporate board of directors. "This is about vision, about taking this street to the next level." Darren Yu was 33, precise in the way that expensive law school taught, and he'd handled the legal aspects of Victor's expansion with ruthless efficiency. He'd researched my property thoroughly, looking for any liens, violations, or legal vulnerabilities that might force a sale. "Mr. Mercer," Darren had said, consulting his tablet, "your apartment represents a significant impediment to the comprehensive development of this commercial district. While you certainly have the legal right to refuse our offers, you should consider the practical implications of your decision." "What practical implications?" "Well, for instance, noise ordinances don't apply to commercial renovations conducted during legal hours. And as businesses expand and update their operations, there may be disruptions to your quality of life." The message was clear. Sell, or we'll make your life miserable. I'd declined that offer too, but Victor hadn't given up. Instead, he'd changed tactics. Janine began what she called community outreach, stopping by my apartment with homemade cookies and friendly conversation. She'd compliment my father's furniture, ask about my work, and gradually steer every conversation toward the benefits of moving on to the next chapter of my life. "You're still young, Calvin," she'd said during one of these visits, perched on my couch with a cup of tea and a calculating smile. "You could take Victor's offer and buy a beautiful house somewhere quiet. Maybe find a nice woman, start a family. This place is so limiting." "Limiting how?" "Well, it's not exactly conducive to entertaining, is it? And the noise from the businesses below? It must make it difficult to have guests over." The irony was that Janine's restaurant was one of the primary sources of that noise, with their late-night cleanup crews and early morning deliveries. But pointing that out would have been impolite, and I'd been raised to be polite. As the months passed, the disruptions Darren had mentioned became more frequent and more pointed. Construction noise that served no apparent purpose, delivery trucks that blocked my parking space, health inspectors who needed access to my apartment to check for potential health code violations, related to the businesses below. The breaking point came 6 months ago, when I discovered that someone had been going through my mail. Bills had been opened and resealed, and a letter from my mother had arrived 3 days late with obvious signs of tampering. When I complained to the postal service, they suggested that I install a locking mailbox, which I did, only to find it vandalized a week later. That's when the anonymous notes started. Simple messages at first. "Consider your options. Time is running out. Smart people know when to walk away." I'd saved every note, documenting the escalation, though I wasn't sure what I planned to do with the evidence. The police had been politely unhelpful when I'd reported the mailbox vandalism, suggesting that it was probably just random mischief and that I shouldn't read too much into it. But Eleanor had been reading plenty into it. During our morning conversations, she'd begun offering cryptic warnings about dangerous people who want what isn't theirs, and folks who think money can buy anything, including other people's lives. Her observations were always oblique, but her concern was genuine. "You're a good man, Calvin," she'd said just last week. "But good men sometimes finish last when they are dealing with bad people, and there are some very bad people circling around you right now." I'd asked her what she meant, but Eleanor had just shaken her head and told me to keep your eyes open and your guard up. Now, standing in my apartment with the latest threatening note in my hand, I finally understood what she'd been trying to tell me. This wasn't about real estate development or commercial expansion. This was about power, and about people who were used to getting what they wanted regardless of who stood in their way. The question was, how far were they willing to go? I walked to my window and looked down at the street below. Victor's restaurant was still busy with the dinner crowd, and I could see him moving between tables, playing the role of the charming host. But when he glanced up at my window, his mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something cold and calculating in his expression. That night, I called my mother in Arizona. At 67, Miriam Mercer had retained the sharp wit and protective instincts that had made her a formidable force during my childhood. "Calvin, sweetheart, you sound tired," she said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "I'm fine, Mom. Just dealing with some pressure from the neighbors." "What kind of pressure?" I gave her the abbreviated version, leaving out the threatening notes but explaining the escalating offers and the not-so-subtle intimidation tactics. "Oh, honey," she said when I'd finished, "your father would be so proud of you for standing your ground. That apartment isn't just a place to live, it's your heritage, your roots." "I know, but sometimes I wonder if I'm being stubborn for the wrong reasons." "There's a difference between being stubborn and having principles, Calvin. And there's a difference between business pressure and what you're describing. These people sound dangerous." "I'm probably overreacting." "No, you're not. Trust your instincts. And trust that homeless woman who's been looking out for you. Sometimes the people on the margins see things that the rest of us miss." After I hung up, I sat in my father's old recliner and tried to imagine what he would have done in my situation. He'd been a practical man, but he'd also been fiercely protective of what was his. He'd taught me that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were stacked against you. The next morning, I found another note under my door. This one was different, more direct, more threatening. Last chance, sell now or you'll regret it. As I read it, I noticed Eleanor watching me from across the street. Even from that distance, I could see the worry in her eyes, and I realized that whatever was coming next, she'd already seen the signs. The escalation came on a Thursday night, during what the business owners called their monthly networking mixer at Hannigan's Pub, 3 blocks down from Meridian Street. I hadn't planned to attend. These gatherings were typically exercises in mutual back-patting and thinly veiled gossip. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to hear what they said about me when they thought I wasn't listening. Hannigan's was the kind of neighborhood bar that tried too hard to be authentic, with exposed brick walls and craft beer lists written on chalkboards. The after-work crowd provided perfect cover as I settled into a corner booth with a clear view of the business owner's usual table. Victor held court like a man campaigning for mayor, his voice carrying over the ambient noise as he regaled the group with stories about his expansion plans. Janine sat beside him, playing the supportive wife, while her eyes scanned the room with predatory calculation. Toby from the coffee shop was there, along with Francine from the pastry shop and several other business owners I recognized but didn't know personally. The beauty of comprehensive development, Victor was saying, gesturing with his beer bottle, is that it benefits everyone. Rising tide lifts all boats and all that. Speaking of boats, Francine interjected with a laugh, when are we finally going to get our stubborn neighbor to sail away? The table erupted in knowing chuckles, and I felt my jaw clench involuntarily. Oh, Calvin will come around, Janine said with false sweetness. He just needs the right motivation. What kind of motivation? Asked Pete Morrison, who owned the deli where Eleanor spent her days. Victor leaned forward conspiratorially. Let's just say that sometimes people need help seeing the bigger picture, and sometimes that help comes in the form of practical demonstrations. Practical demonstrations? Toby looked nervous. Victor, please tell me you're not planning anything. Relax, Victor cut him off. I'm talking about legitimate business pressure, market forces, natural consequences of being the only residential tenant in a commercial district. Darren Yu, who'd been quietly nursing his whiskey, finally spoke up. There are numerous legal precedents for encouraging residential to commercial conversion in mixed-use districts, noise ordinances, safety inspections, zoning compliance reviews. All perfectly legitimate. Exactly, Victor said. We're not doing anything illegal. We're just, helping Calvin understand his situation more clearly. I stayed for another 20 minutes, listening to them discuss my life like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. When I finally left, Victor was in the middle of a story about welcoming new business opportunities very soon, and the group was laughing like he'd told the funniest joke they'd ever heard. The walk home took me past Morrison's Deli, where Eleanor was settling in for the night. She looked up as I approached, and even in the dim streetlight, I could see the concern in her eyes. You look troubled, she said simply. Just thinking about things. Dangerous things, from the look of you. Eleanor patted the ground beside her, and I surprised myself by sitting down on the cold pavement. You want to tell me what's got you so wound up? I found myself explaining the evening's revelations, though I kept my voice low and avoided specific names. Eleanor listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Men like that, she said when I'd finished, they think the world owes them whatever they want, and when the world doesn't cooperate, they get creative about taking it anyway. What would you do, in my situation? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying my face in the flickering light from the street lamp. I'd be very, very careful, and I'd start paying attention to things that most people ignore. What kind of things? Who comes and goes at odd hours? Who asks too many questions about your schedule? Who shows up in places they don't belong? She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook. I see a lot from this corner, Calvin, more than most people realize. She handed me the notebook, and I flipped through pages of careful observations written in precise handwriting. Dates, times, license plate numbers, descriptions of suspicious activity around my building. It was like a surveillance log kept by someone with nothing to do but watch and remember. Eleanor, this is incredibly detailed. When you live on the street, you learn to notice things, patterns, changes, people who don't belong. She pointed to an entry from 2 weeks ago. That van parked outside your building at 2 a.m.? It came back 3 times that week. Always the same 2 men, always carrying equipment. I read the entry. White panel van, license plate 7G4HRX, 2 males approx, 30, 40 years old, carrying what appeared to be electronic equipment into building. Stayed 45 minutes. Did you see what they were doing? No, but I heard drilling. quiet drilling, like they were trying not to wake anyone. Eleanor's expression was grim, and I saw one of them talking to that restaurant owner, Victor, the next morning. Friendly conversation, like they knew each other. A sudden wave of icy dread washed over me. You think they were installing surveillance equipment? I think you should assume they were, and act accordingly. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day conducting my own investigation. I found 3 hidden cameras, one in the hallway outside my apartment, one in the building's lobby, and one positioned to monitor the entrance to my parking space. They were small, professional-grade devices that would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for them. I left the cameras in place, but made note of their positions. If Victor wanted to watch me, I'd let him. But I'd also start documenting everything he was doing in return. That afternoon, I visited Fletcher Hardware, the family-owned store where I'd been buying supplies for years. Old Pete Fletcher knew every building in the neighborhood and had opinions about most of their owners. "Calvin, haven't seen you in a while. What can I do for you today?" "I need some new locks for my apartment. Heavy-duty deadbolts." Pete's expression grew serious. "Having security problems?" "Just being cautious." "Smart man. You know, I've had 3 other people from your street asking about security equipment in the past month. A lot of folks feeling nervous lately." "And nervous about what?" Pete glanced around the store, then leaned closer. "Word is, there have been some incidents around buildings where certain developers are trying to expand. Nothing you could prove in court, mind you, but accidents happen, if you know what I mean." "What kind of accidents?" "Fires, mostly. Electrical problems, gas leaks. The kind of things that happen to old buildings when people aren't careful about maintenance." Pete's eyes were steady and serious. "The kind of things that give property owners incentive to sell quickly and cheaply. I bought the locks and a small security camera of my own, then stopped by the police station on my way home. Officer Patrick Heller had been my roommate during our sophomore year at State, and we'd maintained a casual friendship over the years. Patrick was now a detective with the city police, and I hoped he might have some unofficial advice about my situation. "Calvin, good to see you, man. What brings you to our humble precinct?" I explained the situation in general terms, focusing on the harassment and the hidden surveillance equipment. Patrick listened with the professional attention that 20 years of police work had trained into him. "You've got documentation of all this?" "Photos of the cameras, copies of the threatening notes, Eleanor's observation log." "Eleanor?" "The homeless woman who sits outside my building. She's been keeping track of suspicious activity." Patrick raised an eyebrow. "Homeless woman's testimony isn't going to carry much weight in court, Calvin. No offense to her, but prosecutors like witnesses with fixed addresses and clean records." "I understand. But what about the surveillance equipment? That's got to be illegal." "Depends on where it's positioned and who installed it. If the cameras are monitoring common areas and the building owner authorized the installation, it might be perfectly legal." Patrick leaned back in his chair. "Look, I believe you're being harassed, and I believe these developers are playing dirty. But harassment is hard to prove, and playing dirty isn't always illegal. So there's nothing I can do." "I didn't say that. Keep documenting everything. Get a lawyer if you can afford one, and..." Patrick glanced around the squad room, then lowered his voice. "If you ever feel like you're in immediate physical danger, call me directly, day or night. I'll make sure someone responds quickly." He handed me his personal card with his cell phone number written on the back. That evening, as I installed my new locks, I found Eleanor waiting by my building's entrance. Her usual calm demeanor was replaced by something I'd never seen before: fear. "Calvin," she said urgently, grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. "Don't go home tonight." "What? Why?" "I can't explain it all right now, but you need to trust me. Something bad is going to happen, and you don't want to be here when it does." I looked into her eyes and saw absolute conviction. Eleanor had been watching over me for months, documenting threats and warning me about dangers I'd been too naive to recognize. If she said I needed to leave, then I needed to leave. "Where should I go?" "Anywhere, just not here." "And Calvin?" She squeezed my wrist tighter. "When you see what happens, remember that this isn't over. They think they're going to win, but they've just given you everything you need to destroy them." I spent that night walking the city streets, trying to make sense of Eleanor's warning. I called my mother, talked to her about childhood memories and family history until the fear in my chest settled into something resembling calm. I found an all-night diner and sat in a corner booth, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over a city that suddenly felt foreign and dangerous. At 6:47 a.m., my phone buzzed with a news alert. "Major fire on Meridian Street displaces residents, damages multiple businesses." I ran 6 blocks back to my neighborhood, my heart pounding and my mind racing. but by the time I arrived, the fire trucks were already there, and smoke was pouring from the second-floor window that had been my home. I stood on the sidewalk, watching my life burn, and felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. Eleanor had saved my life, but Victor Russo had just made the biggest mistake of his. The fire had been contained to my apartment, which the news reports called fortunate and lucky. What they didn't mention was how convenient it was that the flames had damaged only the residential unit while leaving the commercial spaces below virtually untouched. What they also didn't mention was that the fire had started at 3:17 a.m., when any reasonable person would have been asleep in their bed. I stood on the sidewalk for 2 hours, watching firefighters carry out the charred remains of my father's furniture and my mother's china. The apartment was a total loss, everything I owned reduced to ash and smoke damage. But I was alive, and that meant I could fight back. Detective Patrick Heller arrived at the scene around 8 a.m., still wearing yesterday's clothes and looking like he'd been roused from bed by an urgent phone call. He found me sitting on the curb across from my building, staring at the smoke-stained windows of what had been my home. "Jesus, Calvin, are you okay?" When I heard the address on the scanner, he sat down beside me, his expression grim. "Tell me you weren't inside when it started." "I wasn't. Eleanor warned me not to come home last night." Patrick's eyebrows shot up. "The homeless woman? How did she know?" "I don't know, but she saved my life." We sat in silence for a moment, watching the firefighters finish their work. Finally, Patrick spoke again. "This wasn't an accident, was it?" "No, it wasn't." "Can you prove that?" I thought about Eleanor's notebook, about the hidden surveillance cameras, about Victor's practical demonstrations, and Darren Yu's legal threats. "Not yet, but I'm going to." Patrick stood up and brushed off his pants. "Officially, I can't help you with this. The fire department will conduct their own investigation, and if they find evidence of arson, it'll become a criminal matter. But unofficially," he handed me another business card. "My partner owes me a favor, and she's very good at finding things that other people try to hide." The fire investigator arrived an hour later. Lena Torres was 38, with a kind of methodical demeanor that came from years of sifting through destruction looking for truth. She spent 3 hours examining the scene, taking photographs and collecting samples while I watched from across the street. When she finally approached me, her expression was carefully neutral. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Investigator Torres with the City Fire Department. I understand this was your residence?" "Yes." "I'm sorry for your loss. I know how difficult this must be." She consulted her tablet. "I have a few questions, if you don't mind. Were you home when the fire started?" "No, I was out." "Out where?" I hesitated, knowing how the truth would sound. "Walking around the city. I couldn't sleep." "All night?" "Yes." Torres made a note. "Mr. Mercer, I need to ask you directly. Do you have any reason to believe this fire was deliberately set?" "Yes." "Can you elaborate on that?" I told her about the threats, the harassment, the pressure to sell. I mentioned the hidden cameras and Victor's practical demonstrations, though I was careful not to make direct accusations I couldn't prove. Torres listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Mercer, I'm going to be honest with you. What you're describing sounds like a clear motive for arson, and my preliminary examination of the scene suggests that accelerants were used. This wasn't an electrical fire or a gas leak. Someone wanted your apartment to burn. Can you prove that?" "I'm going to try, but I'll need your help. Do you have documentation of the threats you mentioned?" "Yes, and I have a witness who's been monitoring suspicious activity around my building." "The homeless woman?" "Her name is Eleanor Price, and she's been keeping detailed records of everything she's observed. Dates, times, license plate numbers, descriptions of people who don't belong in the neighborhood." Torres looked intrigued. "I'd like to speak with her." I found Eleanor at her usual spot outside Morrison's Deli, though she looked like she hadn't slept. When I introduced her to Investigator Torres, Eleanor's demeanor shifted from wary to cooperative. "I've been expecting someone like you," Eleanor said simply. "I saw what happened last night, and I know who was responsible." "You witnessed the fire being set?" Torres asked. "Not directly, but I saw the same white van that's been coming around for weeks, parked outside the building at 2:45 a.m. 2 men got out, went inside, stayed for about 20 minutes. Then they left, and 15 minutes later, I smelled smoke." Eleanor handed Torres her notebook. "Everything's documented. Dates, times, license plates, descriptions. That van belongs to someone who works for the restaurant owner, Victor Russo." Torres spent an hour going through Eleanor's observations, cross-referencing them with her own timeline of the fire. When she finished, her expression was grim but determined. "Ms. Price, this is excellent work. Would you be willing to provide an official statement? I'd be delighted to. That afternoon, I visited the public library and spent 4 hours researching property records, business filings, and permit applications related to my building. What I found was a paper trail that painted a clear picture of premeditation. 3 weeks before the fire, Russo Development Group had filed preliminary plans for a comprehensive renovation of my building, including the conversion of the second floor into private dining space. The plan specifically mentioned the removal of existing residential fixtures and structural modifications to accommodate commercial use. 2 weeks before the fire, Victor had applied for a liquor license expansion that would allow him to serve alcohol in the proposed second-floor dining area. 1 week before the fire, Darren Yu had filed a motion with the City Planning Commission to have my building reclassified from mixed use to commercial only, citing safety concerns related to residential occupancy in a primarily commercial district. The paperwork told a story of confidence. These weren't contingency plans in case I decided to sell. These were the detailed preparations of people who knew I wouldn't be living there much longer. I made copies of everything and organized it into a comprehensive file. Then I called the lawyer Patrick had recommended, a woman named Catherine Winters, who specialized in property law and had a reputation for taking on cases that other attorneys considered unwinnable. Catherine's office was in a converted warehouse downtown, and she had the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from years of fighting uphill battles. She listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly just studying my face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to spot lies from across a crowded courtroom. "Mr. Mercer," she said when I'd finished, "what you're describing is coordinated wrongdoing, deliberate property destruction, and a planned attempt to cause fatal harm. These are serious criminal charges, not merely civil matters." "I understand, but I also want them to pay for what they've done. I want my home rebuilt, and I want them to face consequences for thinking they could burn me out." Catherine leaned back in her chair. "The criminal case will be handled by the district attorney's office, assuming investigator Torres can build a solid case. But we can file a civil suit for damages, and we can make it very expensive for Mr. Russo and his associates to continue their harassment." "How expensive?" "Well, let's see. Property damage, temporary housing costs, emotional distress, punitive damages for willful misconduct." Catherine's smile was sharp and predatory. "I'd estimate somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 million. Maybe more, depending on what other evidence we can uncover. Can we win?" "Mr. Mercer, if everything you've told me is true, and if we can prove even half of it in court, we're going to do more than win. We're going to destroy them." That evening, I met with Eleanor behind my damaged building. The sharp scent of char still hung in the air, and the boarded-up windows of what had once been my home looked like hollow, unseeing shapes turned toward the street. "You did the right thing," Eleanor said quietly. "Fighting back instead of running away. I haven't won anything yet." "No, but you've stopped being a victim, and that's the first step toward becoming dangerous." Eleanor's smile was fierce and proud. "Your father would be proud of you, Calvin. You're honoring his memory by refusing to let them erase what he built." "How do you know about my father?" "I know a lot of things. I've been watching this street for longer than you realize, and I've seen what happens to good people when bad people think they can get away with anything." Eleanor handed me a manila envelope. "But I've also seen what happens when good people finally decide to fight back." Inside the envelope were photographs, surveillance photos taken from various angles around my building over the past several weeks. Photos of Victor meeting with the men from the white van. Photos of Darren Yu handing envelopes to city inspectors. Photos of Janine directing workers who appeared to be installing equipment in my building. "Eleanor, how did you get these?" "I told you. I see a lot from my corner, and I have friends who see even more." Her expression was mysterious but determined. "You're not the first good person these vultures have tried to destroy, Calvin. But if we do this right, you'll be the last." As I walked home to the hotel room that would be my temporary residence, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just hope for justice, but hope for revenge. Victor Russo and his associates had made a critical error. They'd assumed that destroying my home would destroy my will to fight. Instead, they'd just given me everything I needed to destroy them. The insurance company's response came exactly 1 week after the fire, delivered via certified mail to my temporary address at the Extended Stay Hotel on Maple Avenue. I opened the envelope expecting a check for the full replacement value of my apartment and everything inside it. Instead, I found a letter that sent a surge of pressure through my chest and left my hands trembling with barely contained fury. "Dear Mr. Mercer," the letter began, "after careful review of your claim and consultation with local authorities, we regret to inform you that your fire damage claim has been flagged for further investigation due to suspicious circumstances surrounding the incident. Payment will be suspended pending the completion of this investigation. The letter went on to explain that someone had contacted the insurance company with credible allegations that I had deliberately set the fire myself in order to collect insurance money and force a buyout of my lease obligations. The anonymous tipster had provided detailed information about my financial situation and my increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to the fire. I read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. Not only had Victor and his associates burned down my home, they were now trying to frame me for the crime. The audacity was breathtaking, but the strategy was brilliant. If they could make me look like an insurance fraudster, it would discredit everything I said about their harassment campaign. I called Catherine Winters immediately. "They're trying to destroy your credibility," she confirmed after I read her the letter. It's a classic defensive strategy. If they can't deny the fire happened, they'll try to blame you for setting it. Can they get away with that? Not if we move fast. I'm going to file an emergency motion to compel the insurance company to release their investigation files. We need to know exactly what allegations were made and who made them. Catherine's voice was sharp with professional anger. In the meantime, I want you to document everything. Every conversation, every interaction, every threat. We're going to war, Calvin, and we need ammunition. The next morning, I returned to my burned apartment building for the first time since the fire. The commercial spaces on the ground floor were already reopening. Victor's restaurant had suffered only minor smoke damage and was advertising grand reopening specials. The irony wasn't lost on me that the fire had been so precisely contained that it had barely disrupted business operations. I climbed the external fire escape to survey the damage to my apartment from the outside. The windows were boarded up, but I could see through the gaps that the interior was completely gutted. 42 years of memories reduced to charred timber and melted metal. As I stood on the fire escape, taking photographs for my insurance file, I noticed something glinting in the debris near what had been my kitchen window. I climbed through the gap in the boarding and found myself standing in the skeleton of my former home. The object that had caught my attention was a small metal lighter, partially melted but still recognizable. I picked it up carefully, using a tissue to avoid contaminating any potential fingerprints. The lighter was engraved with a logo I recognized, Russo Development Group, building tomorrow's success today. I stared at the lighter for a long moment, hardly believing that Victor's people had been careless enough to leave such obvious evidence. Then I carefully wrapped it in the tissue and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Whether it was arrogance or stupidity, they just handed me the smoking gun I needed. That afternoon, I delivered the lighter to Investigator Torres, who received it with the kind of professional excitement that comes from finding the piece of evidence that transforms a theory into a prosecutable case. "Mr. Mercer, this is exactly what we needed. I'll have it tested for prints and DNA, and I'll cross-reference the serial number with purchase records." Torres labeled the evidence bag with meticulous care. "Combined with Ms. Price's testimony and the surveillance photos you provided, we're building a very strong case." "Strong enough to file charges?" "I think so. I'm meeting with the district attorney tomorrow morning to review everything we've collected. If he agrees to prosecute, arrests could happen as early as next week." I left the fire department feeling cautiously optimistic, but my mood darkened when I stopped by Brewster's Coffee House for my usual afternoon caffeine fix. The place was buzzing with conversation, and I quickly realized that I was the primary topic of discussion. Heard he was having financial problems. Insurance money would solve a lot of issues. Always seemed like a loner, you know? The kind of guy who might snap. I ordered my coffee and retreated to a corner table, listening to my neighbors discuss my alleged mental state and criminal tendencies with the casual authority of people who'd watched too many true crime documentaries. The Whisper campaign was working exactly as Victor had intended. By the time this went to trial, half the neighborhood would be convinced that I was an unstable arsonist who'd burned down his own home. But as I sat there listening to the gossip, I also heard something else. Doubt. Not everyone was buying the story Victor was selling. "I don't know," said Margaret Corrin, who owned the flower shop 2 blocks down. "Calvin never seemed like the type to do something like that. He was always polite, always quiet. And why would he burn down his own apartment when he could have just sold it for a fortune?" "Maybe that's exactly why," replied Pete Morrison from the deli. "Maybe he realized he'd made a mistake by holding out so long, and this was his way of getting the money without admitting he was wrong. Or maybe," said a voice from the back of the coffee shop, "someone wanted it to look that way." I turned to see Eleanor standing near the entrance, her weathered coat dripping from the light rain that had started falling. The chatter in the coffee shop fell silent as everyone turned to look at the homeless woman who had just upended their assumptions. "Excuse me?" Pete Morrison's voice was polite but dismissive. Eleanor walked further into the shop. her dignity intact despite the uncomfortable silence that followed her. I said, maybe someone wanted it to look like Calvin set that fire. Maybe someone who had a lot to gain from his apartment burning down. Ma'am, Toby Brewster said nervously, I'm going to have to ask you to what? To stop telling the truth? Eleanor's voice carried a strength that surprised everyone in the room. I've been sitting outside this building for 3 years, watching and listening. I know who's been threatening Calvin, and I know who had the most to gain from that fire. Victor Russo chose that moment to enter the coffee shop, his timing so perfect that it seemed choreographed. He took in the scene, Eleanor standing in the center of the room, me sitting in the corner, the uncomfortable silence hanging over everyone, and his smile was pure predatory satisfaction. Well, well, Victor said loudly. Looks like we're having a neighborhood meeting. Mind if I join the discussion? We were just talking about the fire, Margaret Corrin said carefully. Ah, yes, the fire. Victor's voice dripped with false sympathy. Such a tragedy. Poor Calvin, losing everything like that. Though I have to say, I'm not entirely surprised. What do you mean? Eleanor asked, her eyes fixed on Victor's face. Well, he'd been under a lot of pressure lately. Financial pressure, emotional pressure. Sometimes people crack under that kind of stress and make poor decisions. The implication was clear, and several people in the coffee shop nodded knowingly. But Eleanor wasn't backing down. Funny thing about that pressure, she said conversationally. Most of it seemed to come from people who wanted to buy his apartment, people who stood to make a lot of money if he was forced to sell. Victor's smile faltered slightly. I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. And the fact is, Calvin Mercer is an honest man who was being harassed by people who thought they could intimidate him into giving up his home. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Victor's mask of false concern was slipping, revealing something cold and dangerous underneath. Ms. Victor let the question hang in the air. Price. Eleanor Price. Ms. Price, I understand that you're fond of Calvin, but fondness doesn't change facts. And the fact is that Calvin was facing serious financial pressures and had been behaving erratically for weeks before the fire. The only erratic behavior I observed, Eleanor replied calmly, was coming from the people who were trying to force him out of his home. Victor's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might lose his temper completely, but he managed to maintain his composure, though his voice carried a clear threat. Ms. Price, I'd be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. Slander is a serious legal matter. Eleanor's smile was sharp and fearless. So is arson. The coffee shop erupted in whispers and uncomfortable shifting, but Victor's attention was focused entirely on Eleanor. I could see him calculating, trying to determine how much she knew and how much damage she could do to his carefully constructed narrative. Finally, Victor turned his attention to me. Calvin, I'm sorry you're going through this difficult time. If there's anything I can do to help, you've done enough, I said quietly. Victor's smile was all teeth and no warmth. I hope you get the help you need, Calvin. I really do. As Victor left the coffee shop, the conversations resumed in hushed tones, but the dynamic had shifted. Eleanor's confrontation had planted seeds of doubt, and I could see people looking at the situation with new eyes. That evening, Catherine Winters called with an update on our legal strategy. I've filed the civil suit, she said. Russo Development Group, Victor and Janine Russo personally, and Darren Yu are all named as defendants. We're seeking $2.5 million in damages, plus punitive damages to be determined at trial. When will they be served? Tomorrow morning, which means by tomorrow afternoon, they'll know that you're not just going to disappear quietly. Catherine's voice carried a note of satisfaction. Calvin, I want you to be prepared for them to escalate their harassment. Desperate people do desperate things. I'm ready for whatever they throw at me. Good, because we're about to find out just how far they're willing to go to protect themselves. As I hung up the phone, I realized that everything had been building to this moment. The threats, the fire, the insurance fraud allegations, it had all been preparation for the final confrontation. Tomorrow, Victor Russo and his associates would learn that I wasn't the helpless victim they'd assumed I was, and I was going to enjoy watching their world burn. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, neighbors, and curious onlookers when I arrived for the hearing on Tuesday morning. Word had spread through the neighborhood that the apartment fire case was going to trial, and everyone wanted to see how the story would end. I spotted Victor and Janine Russo near the entrance, surrounded by their legal team and putting on a show of confident indignation for the cameras. Mr. Mercer, a reporter thrust a microphone in my direction. Do you have any comment on the allegations that you set fire to your own apartment? "The truth will come out in court," I replied calmly, pushing through the crowd toward the courthouse entrance. Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided with the kind of stern authority that suggested she'd seen every type of legal drama imaginable and had little patience for theatrical nonsense. As I took my seat at the plaintiff's table next to Catherine Winters, I could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on my back. "This is it," Catherine murmured. "Everything we've worked for comes down to the next few hours." Across the aisle, Darren Yu was conferring with his clients in urgent whispers. Victor looked calm and confident, but I noticed that Janine kept glancing nervously around the courtroom. Whatever they'd expected when they decided to burn down my apartment, it wasn't this level of public scrutiny. Judge Hendricks called the court to order, and Catherine rose to deliver her opening statement. "Your Honor, this case is about more than property damage or insurance fraud. This is about a coordinated campaign of harassment, intimidation, and ultimately arson, carried out by individuals who believed that money and influence placed them above the law." Catherine's voice carried clearly through the courtroom as she outlined our case. The escalating threats, the hidden surveillance equipment, the suspicious timing of the fire, and the evidence that pointed directly to Victor Russo and his associates. "The defendants will try to convince you that Calvin Mercer burned down his own home for insurance money, but the evidence will show that Mr. Mercer was the victim of a deliberate conspiracy to force him from his property by any means necessary, including a calculated attempt to cause him fatal harm." When Catherine finished, Darren Yu stood to present the defense's version of events. His strategy was exactly what we'd expected. Paint me as a financially desperate man who'd become increasingly unstable under the pressure of multiple buyout offers. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Darren began, "Calvin Mercer wants you to believe that he's the victim of an elaborate conspiracy. But the simple truth is that Mr. Mercer was facing serious financial difficulties and saw an opportunity to solve his problems through insurance fraud." Darren's presentation was smooth and professional, but I could see that some of the jurors looked skeptical. The story he was telling required them to believe that I'd been clever enough to orchestrate a complex insurance fraud scheme while simultaneously being too stupid to avoid leaving evidence that pointed back to my supposed co-conspirators. The first witness Catherine called was investigator Lena Torres. Lena's testimony was methodical and devastating, walking the jury through her investigation of the fire scene and the evidence that proved arson had been committed. "The fire was definitely set deliberately," Lena testified. "Multiple accelerants were used, and the burn pattern indicates that the fire was started in at least 3 different locations within the apartment." "In your professional opinion," Catherine asked, "could Mr. Mercer have set this fire himself?" "It's possible, but extremely unlikely. The timing and placement of the accelerants suggest that whoever set this fire had detailed knowledge of the building's layout and access to professional-grade equipment. This wasn't the work of an amateur." "Did you find any physical evidence linking the defendants to the fire?" Lena held up the evidence bag containing the lighter I'd found in the debris. This lighter was recovered from the scene. It bears the logo of Russo Development Group and contains partial fingerprints that match Victor Russo. A murmur ran through the courtroom, and I saw Victor lean forward to whisper urgently in Darren's ear. "Could this lighter have been planted at the scene after the fire?" Darren asked during cross-examination. "Unlikely," Lena replied. "The lighter shows heat damage consistent with being present during the fire, and it was found beneath debris that hadn't been disturbed since the incident." The next witness was Eleanor Price, and her testimony was the emotional centerpiece of our case. Eleanor had dressed carefully for court. Her best clothes were still worn and patched, but she carried herself with a dignity that commanded respect. "Ms. Price," Catherine began, "please tell the court what you observed on the night of the fire." Eleanor's voice was clear and steady as she recounted the events of that night. The white van arriving at 2:45 a.m., the 2 men entering the building, the smell of smoke that appeared exactly 15 minutes after they left. "Did you recognize either of the men who entered the building?" "I recognized one of them. I'd seen him talking to Victor Russo on multiple occasions over the previous weeks." "Did you warn Mr. Mercer about what you'd observed?" "Yes. I told him not to go home that night. I couldn't prove what was going to happen, but I knew it was going to be bad." During cross-examination, Darren tried to attack Eleanor's credibility, suggesting that her observations were unreliable and that her loyalty to me had colored her testimony. "Ms. Price," Darren said condescendingly, "isn't it true that you're homeless and have been dependent on Mr. Mercer's charity for years?" Eleanor's response was delivered with quiet dignity. "Mr. Mercer has been kind to me, yes, but I've been watching this street for longer than he's lived here, and I know the difference between kindness and conspiracy. Victor Russo and his associates tried to destroy a good man's life for money. I won't stand by and let them get away with it." The third witness was Detective Patrick Heller, who testified about the pattern of harassment and intimidation that had preceded the fire. Patrick's police credentials gave weight to his testimony, and his obvious friendship with me actually worked in our favor. It showed that people who knew me well found the insurance fraud allegations absurd. But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. Mason Varick, one of the men who'd been hired to install the surveillance equipment in my building. Mason had been arrested on unrelated charges 2 weeks after the fire, and when he learned that he was being investigated for arson, he decided to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. "Mr. Varick," Catherine said, "please tell the court about your interactions with Victor Russo in the weeks leading up to the fire." Mason was nervous, but determined to tell his story. Victor hired me and my partner to install hidden cameras around Calvin Mercer's apartment. He said he needed to monitor Mercer's activities for security purposes. But later, he asked us to do something else. "What did he ask you to do?" "He wanted us to set a fire that would look like an electrical accident. He said Mercer was causing problems for his business expansion and that a small fire might convince him to sell and move somewhere safer." "Did you agree to set this fire?" "No. I told Victor that was way beyond what I was willing to do, but he said he'd find someone else who was more flexible about the job requirements." Darren's cross-examination of Mason was aggressive, focusing on his criminal record and his motivation to lie in exchange for a plea deal. But Mason stuck to his story, and his testimony provided the direct link between Victor and the arson plot that we needed to prove conspiracy. The final piece of evidence was the documentation I'd gathered from public records, the premature business filings, the liquor license applications, the zoning change requests. Catherine presented these documents as proof that Victor had been planning to take over my apartment long before the fire occurred. "Your Honor," Catherine said, "these documents show that the defendants were so confident that Mr. Mercer would be forced to vacate his apartment that they began the legal process of converting it to commercial space weeks before the fire. This isn't the behavior of people who were simply making legitimate business offers. This is the behavior of people who knew that Mr. Mercer wouldn't be living there much longer." When it came time for the defense to present their case, Darren's strategy fell apart almost immediately. Victor took the stand in his own defense, and his arrogance proved to be his downfall. "Mr. Russo," Darren asked, "did you or anyone acting on your behalf set fire to Calvin Mercer's apartment?" "Absolutely not. The suggestion is ridiculous." "Can you explain how your company lighter ended up at the fire scene?" Victor's answer was smooth but unconvincing. "I have no idea. I give those lighters out as promotional items all the time. Anyone could have had one." But during Catherine's cross-examination, Victor's composure cracked. "Mr. Russo, isn't it true that you told multiple people that Mr. Mercer would regret it if he didn't sell his apartment?" "I may have expressed frustration with his unreasonable position, and isn't it true that you filed paperwork to convert his apartment to commercial use before he'd agreed to sell?" "We were preparing for multiple contingencies." "Including the contingency that his apartment might burn down?" "That's not what I said." "But that's what happened, isn't it? His apartment burned down, and you immediately moved forward with your expansion plans." Victor's face was red with anger, and his voice carried a threatening edge that the jury couldn't miss. "Calvin Mercer brought this on himself. He was warned repeatedly that his stubbornness would have consequences." The courtroom erupted in whispers, and Judge Hendricks had to bang her gavel for order. Victor had just admitted on the stand that he'd been threatening me, and his lawyer's face had gone pale with horror. Janine's testimony was even more disastrous. She tried to maintain the fiction that they'd been innocent business people making legitimate offers, but Catherine's cross-examination revealed the depth of her involvement in the harassment campaign. "Mrs. Russo, did you tell other business owners that Calvin Mercer would be gone soon?" "I may have mentioned that we were optimistic about reaching an agreement. This was 2 days before the fire, wasn't it?" "I don't remember the exact timing. And didn't you tell Margaret Corrin from the flower shop that you were planning a grand reopening celebration for the week after the fire?" Janine's composure cracked completely. "We had contingency plans. Any good business has contingency plans." "Contingency plans that included celebrating the destruction of a man's home?" By the time closing arguments began, the outcome was clear. Darren Yu made a valiant attempt to salvage his client's case, but the evidence was overwhelming. Victor and Janine had been caught in multiple lies, their co-conspirator had testified against them, and the physical evidence directly linked them to the arson. Catherine's closing argument was a masterpiece of controlled fury. The defendants thought they could burn Calvin Mercer out of his home and frame him for the crime. They thought their money and influence would protect them from consequences. They were wrong. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood to deliver their verdict. "In the matter of Mercer versus Russo Development Group, we find for the plaintiff. We award Calvin Mercer compensatory damages in the amount of $1.2 million and punitive damages in the amount of $3.8 million. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Victor Russo's face drained of all color as the full implications of the verdict sank in. $5 million in damages would bankrupt his company and destroy his reputation. Janine was crying, and Darren Yu was frantically taking notes for what would undoubtedly be a futile appeal. But Judge Hendricks wasn't finished. Furthermore, she announced, I am referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. The evidence presented in this trial suggests that serious felonies were committed, and justice demands that the responsible parties face criminal charges. As the judge's gavel fell for the final time, I stood quietly at the plaintiff's table, watching Victor and Janine Russo's world collapse around them. The reporters were already swarming toward them, shouting questions about the verdict and the impending criminal charges. Their business partners were backing away, clearly eager to distance themselves from the scandal. Eleanor Price caught my eye from the gallery and nodded once, her expression fierce with satisfaction. Patrick Heller was grinning broadly, and Catherine Winters was already fielding calls from reporters who wanted to interview the lawyer who'd taken down one of the city's most aggressive development companies. Victor Russo tried to push through the crowd of reporters, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. As he passed my table, he stopped and leaned close enough that only I could hear his words. This isn't over, Mercer. I looked him in the eye and smiled. Yes, it is. As the courtroom emptied and the reporters chased their stories, I sat alone at the plaintiff's table, holding the court order that would restore my home and destroy the people who'd tried to erase me. The gavel had fallen, justice had been served, and Victor Russo's empire was burning to the ground.